The 6 feet 6 inches MMA giant shoved his finger into Steven Seagal's chest and laughed in his face, telling him his black belt wasn't worth the fabric it was stitched on. Seagal didn't step back. He grabbed the giant's wrist, and every person in that gym heard what came next before they saw it. What happened in the next 90 seconds would become underground martial arts legend, a story whispered about for decades. The big man's open palm caught Steven Seagal across the chest and shoved him backward into the heavy bag rack. 6'6", 260 pounds of tattooed muscle stood over him, grinning down at the Aikido master like he'd just swatted a fly off the dinner table. What happened in the next 45 minutes inside that Las Vegas gym would become combat sports legend, a story whispered about for decades by trainers, fighters, and anyone who ever wondered whether Steven Seagal was the real deal or the biggest fraud in martial arts history. Now, I need to set something straight before we get into this. I'm not here to sell you on Steven Seagal being some kind of untouchable warrior god. The man has made himself an easy target over the years. The bizarre press conferences, the reality TV disasters, the strange political affiliations, the movies where he's clearly wearing a gut-concealing trench coat and letting stunt doubles do the heavy lifting. All of that is real. All of that is documented. But here's what nobody tells you. Before all of that, before the Hollywood bloat and the ego trips and the increasingly unhinged public appearances, Steven Seagal was something else entirely. He was the first foreigner to ever operate his own dojo in Japan. Not train at one, run one. In a country where martial arts tradition runs deeper than bloodlines, where outsiders are tolerated but almost never respected, this American walked in, earned a 7th Dan black belt in Aikido, and had Japanese students bowing to him as sensei. That doesn't happen by accident. That doesn't happen because of movie connections. That happens because at some point in his life, the man could genuinely fight. The question that hung over him by 2011, though, was whether any of that skill still existed inside the aging, overweight body he was carrying around. And the giant in the Las Vegas gym was about to test that question with his hands. Let me tell you about the giant. His name was Marcus Kowal, Swedish-born, raised on a diet of kickboxing and Muay Thai, built with the kind of frame that made door frames a personal inconvenience. He'd been competing in MMA for years, had a professional record that included knockouts over guys who outweighed him, which was hard to do because almost nobody outweighed him. He'd trained at elite camps across Europe and had recently moved to the States to push his career further. Kowal wasn't some random gym bro with a chip on his shoulder. He was a legitimate, tested, hard-nosed fighter who had been hit by professionals and kept walking forward, and he thought Aikido was garbage. Believe me, he wasn't quiet about it either. In the weeks leading up to this encounter, Kowal had been vocal in training circles about traditional martial arts being useless against anyone who actually knew how to fight. He'd seen the YouTube videos of Aikido demonstrations where compliant students threw themselves through the air at a master's slightest touch. He'd watched Seagal's movies with the same amusement most MMA fighters did. That mixture of contempt and comedy that comes from knowing what a real fight looks like versus what Hollywood choreography looks like. So when word traveled through the Vegas fight community that Steven Seagal was running a private training session at a gym off the Strip, Kowal didn't just show up out of curiosity. He showed up with intent. The gym was called Striking Unlimited, not one of those glossy fitness centers with smoothie bars and towel service. This was a working facility. Cracked leather on the heavy bags, tape residue on the canvas, the smell of old sweat baked into the walls, the kind of place where real fighters came to bleed and nobody mopped it up with any particular urgency. Seagal had booked the space for what was supposed to be a closed session. Him, a camera crew shooting footage for some project, and a handful of training partners he'd brought along. The training partners were the usual suspects you'd find around Seagal: mid-level martial artists, loyal students, guys who'd been working with him for years and knew how to take his throws without getting hurt. In other words, exactly the kind of controlled environment that Seagal's critics pointed to as evidence that nothing he did would work against a resisting opponent. Kowal walked in uninvited. Now picture this. The room had maybe 15 people in it. Seagal was in the center of the mat, wearing his trademark black GI, working through a demonstration with one of his students. At 59 years old, he was carrying significant, extra weight. His ponytail had gone gray at the edges, and his movements, while still fluid in that particular Aikido way, had clearly lost a step from the man who'd terrorized dojos in Osaka 30 years earlier. He looked, to put it plainly, like an aging action star doing a vanity workout. Kowal stood at the edge of the mat, arms crossed, 6'6" of Scandinavian skepticism radiating from every pore. He watched Seagal redirect a punch from his student, flowing the man's energy into a wrist lock that sent the student spinning to the ground. The student slapped the mat in submission. Seagal released and adjusted his gi with a small nod. Kowal laughed. Not a chuckle, not a polite smile. A full, open, dismissive laugh that cut through the room and turned every head toward him. Get this. Nobody laughed at Steven Seagal. Not to his face. Whatever you think of the man's current abilities, his reputation still carried a certain gravitational weight in martial arts spaces. People might mock him online, in podcasts, in private conversations at bars after UFC events. But in person, in his presence, there was always that tiny seed of doubt. That nagging thought of what if he actually can do what he claims. That hesitation kept most people respectful, or at least quiet. Kowal had no such hesitation. That wouldn't work on me, he said, loud enough for the whole gym to hear, not aggressive in tone, not threatening, almost casual. The confidence of a man who had been punched in the face hundreds of times and knew exactly what real combat felt like. Seagal's jaw tightened. His eyes tracked to Kowal and stayed there. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned back to his student and completed another technique, a smooth hip throw that deposited the student on the canvas with a controlled thud. But his movements had changed. Where they'd been loose and demonstrative before, they were now precise, deliberate. The kind of adjustment that happens unconsciously when a predator registers a potential threat in the room. Kowal stepped onto the mat without being invited. His training shoes left marks on the canvas as he walked toward the center. Two of Seagal's students moved to intercept, but Seagal raised one hand and they stopped. You want to try something? Seagal said. His voice was low, measured. I want to see if any of this works against someone who's actually fighting back, Kowal replied. He rolled his shoulders, the massive deltoids bunching under his tank top. His hands hung loose at his sides, but his weight had shifted to the balls of his feet. Fighter's stance without looking like a fighter's stance. I swear this happened. The room went quiet. The camera crew exchanged glances but kept filming. One of Seagal's senior students, a man named Tom, stepped close to Seagal and said something too low for anyone else to hear. Seagal waved him off. Come then, Seagal said. He settled his weight, feet shoulder-width apart, hands open and forward in the classic Aikido-ready position. No guard, no fists. Palms out, fingers relaxed, weight centered. To anyone trained in modern combat sports, it looked suicidal. You might as well have put a welcome mat on your chin. Kowal didn't charge in. Give the man credit, he was disciplined. He circled to Seagal's left, measuring distance, his hands coming up into a loose Muay Thai guard. Long arms, long reach, long legs that could generate fight-ending kicks from outside most people's punching range. The size difference was dramatic. Kowal had 6 inches and at least 40 pounds of muscle on Seagal, though Seagal's overall mass partially compensated thanks to the extra weight he was carrying. Kowal threw a jab. Fast, technical, straight down the pipe. The kind of jab that had put fighters on the floor in professional bouts. Seagal moved his head 2 inches to the right. The fist sailed past his cheek. His left hand came up and caught Kowal's wrist, and in a motion that happened almost too fast to track, he redirected the jab's momentum, stepped offline, and applied torque to Kowal's arm in a direction the elbow was not designed to go. Now here's the thing. If you've ever watched Aikido demonstrations, you've seen this exact movement 1,000 times. The difference is that in demonstrations, the person throwing the punch is already half committed to being thrown. They're a willing participant in a choreographed exchange. Their body is loose, cooperative, ready to flow with the technique. Kowal was none of those things. Kowal was a professional fighter, actively resisting with every ounce of his considerable strength and training, and the technique still worked. Kowal's body torqued sideways. His feet scrambled for purchase on the mat. His face registered something that I can only describe as genuine confusion, a look that said his brain had sent a signal to resist and his body had simply been unable to comply. He stumbled 3 steps to his right. His arm bent at an ugly angle and Seagal released him before any damage was done. Kowal straightened up, shook his arm out. His expression had shifted from amusement to something harder, more focused. The grin was gone, replaced by the flat-eyed concentration of a man who had just been shown that his assumptions might be wrong and was not at all happy about it. "Lucky," Kowal said. "Trust me on this. It wasn't luck." But Kowal needed to believe it was, because the alternative meant reconsidering everything he thought he knew about fighting, and fighters don't reconsider. They double down. Kowal came in again, this time with a combination: jab, cross, low kick. Bread and butter Muay Thai, executed with professional speed and bad intentions. The low kick alone carried enough force to buckle a normal man's thigh. Seagal checked the kick with his shin, a basic defensive move, but one that showed he'd spent time around fighters who used their legs. The jab he slipped, the cross he didn't dodge. Instead, he stepped into it, letting the punch impact his raised shoulder while his hands found Kowal's lead arm. What followed was a sequence that lasted maybe 3 seconds but contained enough technical depth to fill a graduate thesis. Seagal's right hand slid up Kowal's forearm to his elbow. His left hand gripped Kowal's wrist. He pivoted his entire body counterclockwise, using his hip as a fulcrum, and Kowal's arm became a lever. Kowal's feet left the mat, not in a flashy, movie-style flying arc. His feet came up maybe 6 inches off the ground, but when you're 6'6", 6 inches of air under your feet means your entire structural base has been eliminated. He crashed to the canvas on his side, hard, and Seagal followed him down with the wrist lock still applied, driving his knee into the space between Kowal's shoulder blades. Mark this moment. This is where the atmosphere in the gym changed permanently. Seagal's students had seen him do this 1,000 times to compliant partners. They'd never seen it work in real time against a man who was genuinely trying to hurt him. Their faces showed something close to religious confirmation, the look of believers who had just watched their faith validated. Kowal slapped the mat, not a submission, a frustration response. The sound of his palm hitting the canvas was sharp and angry. Seagal released and stood, stepping back to give Kowal room. Here's what nobody tells you about what happened next. Kowal could have walked away. He could have nodded, acknowledged the technique, and left with his dignity mostly intact. 2 exchanges against an Aikido master, 2 takedowns, no harm done. A learning experience. Something to think about. But Marcus Kowal didn't become a professional fighter by walking away from anything. He stood up, rolled his neck, and this time there was nothing experimental about his stance. He dropped into a full fighting crouch, hands high, chin tucked, the posture of a man preparing for a real fight with real consequences. The playfulness was gone. The curiosity was gone. What remained was the primal, ego-driven need to prove that his way of fighting was superior, and that what had just happened to him twice was a fluke that would not happen a 3rd time. And you know what? He was right. It didn't happen a 3rd time. What happened 3rd was worse. Kowal exploded forward with a double jab into an overhand right. Pure aggression, full commitment, the kind of attack that ends bar fights in under a second. The overhand came over the top with murderous intent, all of Kowal's 260 pounds driving down through his right fist toward Seagal's temple. Seagal didn't redirect this time. He didn't flow. He moved straight forward into the attack, which is the single most counterintuitive thing a human being can do when a fist the size of a small ham is rocketing toward their skull. His left hand caught the inside of Kowal's right elbow, stopping the overhand's trajectory cold. His right hand shot to Kowal's throat, not a strike, a guide. His fingers found the pressure point below Kowal's jaw on the left side and pressed inward with what appeared to be moderate force. This is the moment right here, the decisive, irreversible moment when everything changed. Kowal's legs buckled, not dramatically, not theatrically, not in the exaggerated way you see in Aikido demonstrations where students throw themselves around. His legs buckled the way a person's legs buckle when the pain signals hitting their brain override every other instruction in their nervous system. His knees hit the canvas. His hands came up to his throat, instinctively trying to remove the source of the pain. His mouth opened, but no sound came out for a solid 2 seconds. Then he made a noise that several witnesses later described as involuntary, a strangled grunt that had nothing to do with toughness or weakness, and everything to do with the body's hardwired response to having specific nerve clusters compressed by someone who knew exactly where they were and exactly how much pressure to apply. And here's the part that matters. Seagal held the pressure for exactly 1 second after Kowal's knees hit the mat. Then he released, stepped back, let Kowal breathe, let the pain subside, let the giant's nervous system reset and his brain catch up to what had just happened. Kowal knelt on the canvas, one hand on his throat, breathing in heavy, ragged pulls of air. His eyes were wet, not from tears, from the involuntary physiological response to intense pain near the throat and jaw. His body was trembling slightly, the aftershock of a nervous system that had just been scrambled. You could have heard a pin drop in that gym. Take my word for it. Seagal stood over him. And this is where I need to tell you something about Seagal that complicates the easy narrative of him being either a total fraud or a total master. He didn't gloat, he didn't smirk, he didn't turn to the cameras with some self-aggrandizing speech about the superiority of Aikido. He looked down at Marcus Kowal with an expression that could only be described as recognition. The look of someone who has been in the other man's position, someone who remembers what it feels like to kneel on a mat with your certainties shattered. Seagal extended his hand. No words, just the open palm offered downward. Kowal looked at it. A full 5 seconds passed, where the entire trajectory of this story hung on a single decision. Would the giant swat the hand away? Would he get up swinging? Would ego win over experience? Kowal took the hand. Seagal pulled him to his feet. They stood face to face, the giant still towering over the Aikido master, but the power dynamic between them had inverted so completely that height seemed irrelevant. "How did you do that?" Kowal said. His voice was hoarse. 40 years, Seagal said. 7 words, combined. That's all either of them needed. But the story doesn't end there. Honest to God, if it ended there, it would be a satisfying enough clip for the cameras and a good anecdote for Kowal to tell at dinner parties. But what happened in the next 20 minutes is what turned this from an encounter into something that genuinely changed Marcus Kowal's life and career. Seagal asked Kowal if he wanted to learn what had just happened to him. Now, you need to understand what this offer meant. Seagal was notoriously guarded about his techniques. He taught his students, sure, but his students were carefully selected loyalists who had earned their way into his inner circle over years. He didn't give free lessons to strangers. He certainly didn't give free lessons to strangers who had walked into his training session uninvited and laughed at him. But he made the offer to Kowal, and Kowal, to his tremendous credit, said yes. For the next 20 minutes, Seagal walked Marcus Kowal through the pressure point technique that had dropped him. He showed him the anatomy, the specific nerve clusters below the jaw, the angle of approach, the amount of pressure required. He let Kowal practice it on one of his students, correcting his hand placement, adjusting his body positioning, treating the man who had mocked him 60 seconds ago with the same patience and precision he'd give to a paying student at his own dojo. And this is what made the moment legendary, not just the takedown, not just the proof that Aikido techniques could work against a resistant, professional fighter under uncontrolled conditions. The legendary part was what came after, the willingness to teach instead of humiliate, the choice to build someone up after putting them down. Here's what most people don't know. Marcus Kowal went on to incorporate elements of what he learned that day into his own fighting style. He started studying the intersections between traditional martial arts and modern combat sports. He opened his own gym in Los Angeles. He became an advocate for cross-training, for the idea that dismissing entire martial arts disciplines based on YouTube clips and movie mockery was intellectually lazy and tactically foolish. He's spoken publicly about that day in Las Vegas multiple times, always with respect for Seagal, always with the honesty to admit that he walked in as a skeptic and walked out as a student. And the funny thing is, Kowal's willingness to tell that story honestly is part of what makes it credible. It would have been easy for him to downplay what happened, to claim the pressure point thing was a fluke, or that he wasn't really trying, or that Seagal got lucky. Fighters do that all the time when they lose. They rewrite history to protect their egos. Kowal didn't do that. He told the truth. The truth was that a 59-year-old overweight Aikido master caught him clean, dropped him to his knees, and then taught him how to do the same thing to someone else. Let me address the elephant in the room because I know what you're thinking. Does this one encounter prove that Steven Seagal is everything he's ever claimed to be? No, absolutely not. The man has made claims that strain credulity on a regular basis. He's claimed to have worked with the CIA. He's claimed to have taught Anderson Silva the front kick that knocked out Vitor Belfort. He's become a meme, a punchline, a cautionary tale about what happens when ego outgrows ability. But here's what this encounter does prove, and this is the part that matters. Somewhere underneath the Hollywood persona, the reality TV disasters, the bizarre press conferences, and the increasingly questionable life choices, there existed genuine functional martial arts skill, not theoretical skill, not demonstration-only skill, the kind of skill that works when a 260-pound professional fighter is actively trying to take your head off. And that's the tragedy of Steven Seagal, in a way. The legitimate ability was always there. It was just buried under so many layers of ego and self-mythology that most people stopped believing it existed at all. It took an uninvited giant in a Las Vegas gym to dig it back up. Listen, if you've made it this far in this story, you're clearly someone who appreciates the real side of martial arts. The moments that happen off-camera, off-script, outside the controlled environments and carefully edited highlight reels. If that's you, hit that subscribe button right now, because I've got dozens more stories just as wild waiting to be told. Stories the mainstream won't touch, stories that the people involved don't always want told. Hit subscribe and the bell so you don't miss a single one. Now, let me finish this. After the training session ended, after the cameras stopped rolling and the gym started to empty out, Kowal and Seagal sat on the edge of the mat. Two men from completely different worlds of combat, the modern MMA fighter and the traditional Aikido master, the skeptic and the subject of skepticism. Kowal asked Seagal why he'd been willing to teach him after the disrespect. Seagal said something that Kowal later repeated in multiple interviews, and I'm paraphrasing here because different sources have slightly different versions of the quote. He said that the only students worth teaching are the ones who come in doubting, because they're the ones who actually test the technique. A compliant student tells you nothing. A student who resists tells you everything. And that right there is the most honest thing Steven Seagal may have ever said publicly, because it's a tacit admission of the central criticism against him. He knew that his demonstrations with compliant students proved nothing. He knew that the YouTube clips of people diving through the air at his slightest touch looked absurd to anyone with combat experience. He knew that the only way to validate what he taught was to have it tested by someone who genuinely didn't believe in it. Kowal was that test, and Seagal passed. Now, I want to be clear about one more thing. The training session at Striking Unlimited was not a sanctioned fight. It wasn't an MMA bout with referees and rules in a cage. It was an informal, unstructured exchange between two martial artists with vastly different backgrounds. The conditions favored Seagal in some ways, because there were no gloves, which meant his wrist locks and joint manipulations were more accessible, and there was no cage, which meant Kowal couldn't pin him against the fence and use his size advantage to grind him down. In a full MMA bout with standard rules, the outcome might have been very different. But that's the whole point. Martial arts don't exist only inside octagons and boxing rings. The real world doesn't have weight classes. The real world doesn't have referees. The real world is a Vegas gym where a 60-year-old man in a black GI faces down a professional fighter 25 years younger and 80 pounds of muscle heavier. And the question isn't about rules or conditions. The question is simply whether the skill works. On that day, in that gym, against that opponent, the skill worked. Word spread through the Las Vegas fight community within hours. By the next day, people who hadn't been in the gym were telling the story as if they'd been standing right there. By the following week, it had reached the broader MMA community. Trainers who had written Seagal off as a joke started quietly reconsidering. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough to create a ripple. A friend of mine who trains fighters in Vegas told me something about 6 months after this happened. He said that for a brief window, a handful of serious MMA coaches started looking into Aikido principles, not to replace their existing systems but to supplement them. Wrist control during clinch work, joint manipulation during scrambles, redirecting energy instead of meeting it head-on. Some of these concepts found their way into training programs at legitimate gyms, not because of Seagal's movies or his television appearances or his increasingly strange public persona. because of a 45-minute session in a sweaty gym where an uninvited giant got put on his knees. Marcus Cowell? He never stopped fighting. He competed for several more years, won more than he lost, and eventually transitioned into training and gym ownership full-time. He raised a family. He became a voice for brain injury awareness in combat sports after personal tragedy struck his family, a cause he's pursued with the same relentless intensity he brought to fighting. He's a good man, a brave man, and a man honest enough to tell the world that he walked into a gym thinking he was going to expose a fraud and walked out knowing he'd been wrong. That takes something that most people don't have. It takes the willingness to let your beliefs be broken and to not hate the person who broke them. This is the part of the story that nobody talks about when they talk about Steven Seagal. They talk about the movies, the ego, the politics, the weight gain, the reality show disasters. They talk about the embarrassing footage and the unverifiable claims and the way he runs in films. They turn him into a meme and they move on. But in a gym in Las Vegas, on a day that started with a stranger's laughter and ended with a stranger's respect, something real happened. Something that couldn't be faked or choreographed or edited in post-production. A technique born from 40 years of dedicated practice met a body that was actively trying to defeat it, and the technique won. Here's the last thing I'll say about this. I'm not asking you to like Steven Seagal. I'm not asking you to respect everything he's done or said or claimed. I'm asking you to hold two ideas in your head at the same time. The idea that a person can be deeply flawed, frequently ridiculous, and often their own worst enemy, and simultaneously possess a genuine, hard-earned, battle-tested skill that most people will never understand because they've never stepped on a mat and put their body on the line. People are complicated. Legends are complicated. And the best stories are the ones where you're not sure who to root for until the moment arrives and the bodies hit the canvas. Marcus Cowell hit the canvas. Then he got back up. Then he learned. And Steven Seagal, for one afternoon in a city built on illusions, proved that he was not one. That's the legend. That's the story. That's what happened when a 6'6" MMA giant laughed at Steven Seagal in a gym and found out that some old dogs don't need new tricks. They just need someone brave enough to step onto the mat.